Good morning, my name's Sharon Hartle and I'm studying for an MA in English Language Teaching at Leeds Beckett University, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about my research project, which, as you may be able to see from the title, is connected to collocation and the appropriacy of the treatment of collocation in materials that my learners, university students, undergraduates at a high level in the University of Verona, use. So why did I choose this topic? Well, in my experience, collocation causes a lot of difficulties for learners when they come to produce language, and this is reflected in the literature. In 1993, Barnes and Elder saw that advanced German students had problems when it came to producing collocations appropriately, and two other themes are restriction and frequency. Durant and Schmidt in 2009 talked about learners having problems with highly restricted arbitrary combinations of mutual constituents in collocations, and Granger and Beskin are talking about the difficulties learners have with low frequency at the moment. In my context, learners will come to the university in Verona through Carnival and tell you that they have lived a wonderful experience rather than had a wonderful experience. And perhaps more frequently, they'll tell you that they've missed the train, but what they will say is that they've lost the train. So producing collocations is definitely problematic. And the journey from recognition of collocations to production is one that Jane Concert likened to Sisyphus pushing his stone up a hill, and she asked how we could help them. And one of the major questions we have to think about is what collocation is. What should we be teaching? She moved away from the linguistic description of as collocation being the co-occurrence of items over a span of words in a text to something that's possibly more pedagogically relevant, which is the strength of the collocation. The presence of one word means that you strongly expect the other one to be there too. Nesselhauf in 2005 introduced the idea of a free to restricted continuum, where free would be semantically determined words such as read the newspaper, leading to the arbitrarily combined elements such as reach a destination. Another useful measure I felt for learners is Martinez transparent to opaque continuum, where a collocation may be more or less difficult depending on how clear the meaning is from the constituent parts. So my main research question, as I said, was the appropriacy of the treatment in teaching materials, because this is partly where our learners obtain their collocations, and my learners are fairly independent. They go online, so I chose an online site, and I chose Unit 1 in Speak Out Advanced, the course book that we are using in class. As is inevitable during the research journey, the question became somewhat homed, so instead of being just how appropriate is the treatment, it became more specific. How appropriate are the collections selected? And I looked at the appropriacy of selection of these items. This is because of time constraints, really, in my research project. So how did I measure these things? Well, my methodology was mixed methods approach. I began with a quantitative analysis of frequency, which is generally considered to be a good indicator of usefulness when selecting items. And I looked at two corpora, the American corpus and the BNC. But the results you get from analysing corpora are only as good as the corpus you use. And it's very time consuming. A lot of the analysis I had to do was actually interpretative, so it was moving more towards a qualitative analysis, particularly with idioms where, for example, a search of article plus black plus sheep to get the black sheep would produce literal meanings and idiomatic meanings, and I was interested in the idiomatic meanings, which means a manual search. In other cases, in the online materials had an example of to tax the brain, which was not present at all, either in the American corpus or the BNC, but Google produced more than 218,000 hits. So however unreliable Google may be, that has to be taken into account because people are using it. Bell in 2010 warns of the danger of bias, and I applied a preliminary study of the materials design to try to get samples that were as similar as possible to avoid this danger of bias in the samples. And I think, as Borg says, systematicity here is key. He stresses the element of systematicity in teacher research, and I think that by being systematic is the only way to avoid the danger of bias, or to try to. Analysing the content, as I've said, frequency is generally considered a good measure of usefulness, and I analysed the frequency and range of my items in the American corpus and the BNC. Koprovsky in 2005 did an analysis of intermediate course books, and he added a measure of usefulness, which was he averaged the frequency rates over the subgenres of his corpus, and I thought that was a good idea, so I did the same thing, but I found that that was still very much related to frequency and range. And frequency, when with advanced learners, is not perhaps the best measure of appropriacy. Some people believe that advanced learners should be looking at low frequency items. I tend to think that mid-frequency or mid-strength collocations, as Concept said, are probably the ones that are most problematic, because my learners are having problems with to miss the train, which is not a particularly low frequency collocation. So I added 3 filters. I added the free to restriction filter, and for each item I gave it a score of 1 to 5 on this continuum. The transparency opaque continuum from Martinez. And there's some overlap between this and my last one, which was relevance for my learners. And this isn't relevance in the mutual information collocation sense, but relevance for the learners. So taking into account their first language, because some things may be more difficult for one language than another, taking into account their interests, their false friends. So as I said, some overlap between these two categories. My study had several weaknesses. The first one being that it's a very small scale study. Because of time constraints, I looked at the items earmarked for production, because that's where the learners have problems. The samples are not exactly the same. Despite applying a systematic approach to try to find similar samples, the nature of the media means that the samples are not exactly the same. The personal rating is also subjective, but as Martinez said, it provides a starting point for further discussions. It may be subjective, but it is systematic, and for busy teachers or materials writers, I think it's a very useful starting point for further discussion. So, welcome to my data gallery, and we'll start with the online materials, which were actually strong collocations on the home page, but when you went to the page they were business collocations. There are 15 exercises here. They're multiple choice exercises at the sentence level, as you can see. They look like this. And the items were selected alphabetically in 13 of these, and it went from A to C, and then it stopped. There was nothing after C. 2 of these had mixed alphabet selection criteria. What I found particularly difficult, if we have a quicker look at this, was to actually identify the target collocation in some cases, because here, for example, we have economists are forecasting an economic boom. Well, it could be the adjective noun, economic boom, it could be verb noun, or forecasting a boom, or it could be forecasting an economic boom. So out of the 18 items, I actually finished up with a list of 27 items that I analysed. And I had various problems here. I had problems such as spelling mistakes, or fine-tooth comb caused me a lot of problems because I found no examples of this in the corpus again, but I did find examples of fine-toothed comb, so I chose that in the end. Moving on to the results, the frequency, this is normalized over the two corpora, normalized to 1 per million. And you can see that there are variable results here. And as I said, I didn't find that in itself to be particularly useful for my learners, so I added these filters. We have the overall American corpus, the British corpus, then I added the free to constricted continuum, transparent to opaque, relevance to learners, and the green line is the average of of all these scores, which provides the usefulness filter. I set a rate of 2 as being the most useful. This is a rather arbitrary allocation of a score, but it reflects the idea that I'm looking for mid-strength and mid-frequency. And of that, only 9 items out of 27 scored above 2. Partly because they're connected to business, partly because they're restricted or opaque. But this does, I know that this is a small scale study and you can't generalize, but it does underline the need for principled selection of items, because it would have been nice for the learners to find items that were actually more useful for them. Going over to the course book, the design was, I thought, much more principled, including different sections, so they didn't just see an item once, it came up in the course book, the workbook, tests, various things. And there was a definite philosophy of learning here. The learners in the teacher's book write about their belief in the importance of idioms and lexical sets, and Antonia Clare, one of the writers, told me that they drew on their professional experience dictionaries, but not so much corpora, because it is very time consuming to do corpus searches. When I was selecting the cycle, I went through quite a systematic process here as well. In Unit 1, out of the 96 items I found, 45% were single words. Again, not particularly part of my study, but interesting that in the 21st century we still have this focus on single words. Again here, percentages for recognition and production, single words score very highly, and the others are in small fragmented groups. So what I did finally was my collocations that I chose for production were basically collocations of the classic type, but I also added multi-word items, phrasal verbs, and idiomatic phrases because of the highly restricted nature of the constituent parts. The exposure in Unit 1, this shows how often an item came up in the different exercises. Interestingly, the high frequency exposure items are low frequency idioms, and this reflects the writer's philosophy of learning, I think. The frequency didn't tell me very much in particular, except that they were generally fairly low frequency items. Again, this reflects the writer's philosophy, except for some reason named after, which sticks out like a sore thumb. Applying my usefulness filter once again, I found that the gradient was much more gradual here, and that in fact what we find is that only 3 out of the 18 items had a lower than 2 usefulness score. And these were part of the lexical set name, middle name, married name, maiden name. So I did a search for alternative collocations for this, and I found things like full name, good name, real name, assumed, which I thought would be very useful for my learners because it's both opaque and a false friend. I also found maiden voyage, but this would take us out of the lexical set. My conclusions are that this was a small-scale study, of course, and can't be generalised, but it does point to the fact that the materials I found online, very easily accessible to learners, could be more useful. The course book items were generally useful, although perhaps some were more overexposed. My framework is subjective and needs to be developed, but it does provide a systematic starting point. And the next question, I think, is to look at where items are selected from. So, thank you for listening. That's all, folks.